What is up guys, Delboy here. So I wanted to do something a little bit different in this video. I wanted to explain how I got into boxing and I wanted to share the timeline, if you will. Now also if you guys could comment below and explain how you got into boxing and what first started your love for the sport. They would be interesting for me to read, but how did I first get into boxing? Well, I suppose I start with my first exposure to boxing, and that was back in 2002. And I'm sure you know what I'm going to say next. The biggest fight of the year that year was Mike Tyson versus Lennox Lewis, and it was a big deal. I remember the build-up for that fight, I remember the controversy, I remember the brawl between Tyson and Lewis being on news over here in the UK. And, you know, that was my first kind of exposure to the sport. And then the fight happened. Now, I didn't watch the fight live. I actually watched it the next week. And if I remember correctly, and it's a long time ago, I was 8 years old at the time, but, you know, if I remember correctly, the fight was shown the following weekend on either BBC One or ITV. Looking back at it, I'm not even sure whether it was the full fight or just extended highlights, but that was my first major exposure to boxing, and I recall watching it and thinking, oh, this is cool, but, you know, nothing more than that. You know, that wasn't the fight that got me hooked. I just remember watching it, and I remember that being my first experience with boxing as a child. So I remember the Tyson Lewis build-up, and I remember watching it the next weekend after it happened. That was my first exposure to boxing, but it was a couple of years later when my curiosity and interest in boxing first started. 2004 was an Olympic year, and it was held in Athens. And one of the biggest stories to come out of the Olympics during 2004 was the story of Amir Khan. Now, Amir Khan at the time was a 17-year-old baby-faced boxer from Bolton, and he actually went on to win the silver medal in those Olympic Games. He lost to Kindelin in the final. But, you know, that Amir Khan story was a big deal at the time, and following that Amir Khan story live on TV was the first thing that really got me interested in the sport. Bear in mind, at this time, I didn't know the difference between amateur boxing and regular boxing, but the Khan story got me interested, and at that point I started to delve deeper into boxing and do a bit more research, try to watch more boxing, and I then found a fighter called Matt Skelton. Now, Matt Skelton is from an area where I'm from, so he was a local guy. He was a guy you could root for and get behind. You know, he was a local guy who was doing some decent things. He was in some fairly high-profile fights at the time, and I found out about Matt Skelton through a friend at school at the time. His family knew Matt Skelton, and that's how I got introduced to him. And I watched his fights on TV at the time. I believe they was on Sky. Maybe a couple were on ITV, I don't really remember. But weirdly, Matt Skelton was the first pro I started to watch. How weird is that? You know, looking back, who would get into boxing watching Matt Skelton, right? But yeah, I used to follow Matt Skelton's career, and I watched a lot of his fights. This was around 2005, 2006. I believe at the time Skelton was fighting guys like John McDermott, Danny Williams, Michael Sprott, people like that. So I followed his career, and at this time, during this time period, I also obviously latched on to Joe Calzaghe and Ricky Hatton, who were the two most high-profile boxers at that time. I got interested in their careers, and at this point, I wouldn't call myself a hardcore boxing fan. I was more of a casual fan, but my interest in the sport was growing. And the fight that really got me sold on boxing, and, you know, the fight I've never really looked back from, was Michael Katsidis versus Graham Earl. Now, Graham Earl is another guy who is from my local area, and that fight was on ITV4 back in 2007, and that fight was an absolute war. That fight actually finished in 5 rounds, but, you know, it was tremendous. Mickey Vann was the referee that night, and I vividly remember Michael Katsidis badly hurting Graham Earl and dropping him, I believe, and Graham Earl's corner actually threw him the towel, and the referee, Mickey Vann, actually threw the towel out of the ring to allow the fight to continue, and literally right after Mickey Vann throws the towel out of the ring, Graham Earl then drops Michael Katsidis. It was a tremendous fight, and that was the fight that turned me from casual to a hardcore boxing fan, and essentially since then I've not really looked back. But after the Calzaghe and Hatton days as a young teenager, I then sort of latched onto David Haye's career. I was a big David Haye fan as a teenager, as a young teenager. David Haye was actually the guy who kind of inspired me to get involved in boxing for the first time. He was the guy who inspired me to get in the gym and try it out for myself. And, you know, I recalled going into the gym, trying to fight like David Haye and getting my ass absolutely handed to me. But yeah, man, that's essentially how I got into boxing. Since that Graham Earl, Michael Katsidis fight, I've never looked back. I've been hooked since. And I love this sport to death, you know, not really much more than that. But, you know, if you guys could share your stories below, I would be very interested in reading them. I think it's something a bit different and, yeah, something I'm interested in. So, share your thoughts below. Peace.